Hello and welcome. Coming up, has Starmer persuaded Trump not to destroy our motor car makers? The Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, will reveal. Can the SNP reverse the rise of reform in Scotland? I'll ask Scotland's First Minister, John Swinney. Anushka and Swinney have a bleak message for the Prime Minister.
People are feeling pretty down about the state of the country, and we can show you how that's influencing their vote.
And as British politics fragments and fractures, we have three wise advisers: the ex-Tory Minister Therese Coffey, Lib Dem Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper, and Labour's Becky Long-Bailey. Watcher, there's only one question since last week's local and mayoral elections. Is Nigel Farage about to do to UK politics what he did to the UK's relationship with the EU? That is, dismantle how things have been run here for decades. Or is he a meteor who'll crash and burn? Here is why Tory leader Kemi Badenoch should take seriously that reform could destroy her party. And here is why Keir Starmer should take seriously that Farage could be Britain's next Prime Minister. One point is that our first past-the-post electoral system in this era of multi-party political fragmentation means that a party can secure an electoral landslide while winning just about a third of the votes. Labour proved that 10 months ago. And right now, reform is polling just a little below that really important threshold. And then there is Britain's economic story of the past 17 years since the global financial crisis, which has seen stagnation in living standards and dismal productivity growth. That slump is why millions of people see the Tories and Labour as having rejected their legitimate wants and needs. And they feel that they've been feeling that rejection for decades. One way they already expressed their rejection of the big parties was to vote to leave the EU. But hasn't Brexit made us, and them, poorer, you may ask? Yes, that's right. And wasn't Farage the midwife to Brexit? Also true. So why isn't he discredited? Well, his genius, a bit like Donald Trump's, is to blame a malign establishment conspiracy when plans go awry, and to be the champion of the enemies of privilege, all the while being a fully paid-up member of the privileged class. There are plenty of good reasons why the 100 years of Tory and Labour grip on power may be coming to an end. One of them goes by the name of Nigel Farage. Anushka.
Thank you, Robert. Politics has definitely been seriously shaken up. I want to start with this chart from Dylan Difford. It looks at changes in seats at different local elections. You can see it goes up and down over time, but it has never been bigger than what we saw last week. Terrible for the Conservatives in dark blue, down by 674 councillors. Not great for Labour, and here in turquoise, Reform up 677. So where did their massively increased vote come from? I love these vote flow charts from More in Common. The first thing they did was hold on to their own vote. On the left, everyone who voted for reform in 2024. On the right, the 94% who say they are still reform. Now, most of these reform voters, 70% of them, had come from backing Conservatives in 2019, and it looks like Nigel Farage is continuing to inflict a lot of pain on them. 23% who stuck with the Conservatives in 2024 now say they are backing reform. Only 3% say they're going to Lib Dems, 1% to Labour. So it feels like this new right-wing contender is eating up Conservatives, but it is definitely starting to nibble away at Labour too. Actually, back in 2024, very little of Reform's vote came from Labour, but we can see here that that has started to shift. 1/3 of voters deserted Labour since last year's landslide, 11% to Reform, far less than in the case of the Tories, but definitely not insignificant. 5% to Conservatives, 11% to Lib Dems, 4% to Greens, which poses a massive challenge for the Labour Party. What is the narrative that wins back the same numbers, breaking to the left and the right? Robert thinks there isn't one, that they have to choose. They think that improving the cost of living can unite a Green and Reform voter positively. What is clear is that some of their policies are uniting people negatively. This chart shows where some policies have landed. The further up a policy is, the more popular it is. The further to the right is how much people have noticed it. So the happy place for Labour is up here. There is some things there, minimum wage, Keir Starmer's response to Ukraine. The worst place to be on this chart is down here, and I'm afraid there is a lot there. No surprise, winter fuel payments. Nearly everyone knows about them, nearly everyone hates them, but also farmers, inheritance tax, and down here, very quite unpopular still, welfare reforms.
Gosh, so much to chew over. And as Anushka says, I do take the view that Labour can't succeed if it thinks it can somehow woo potential Liberal Democrat, potential Green and potential Reform voters at the same time. I sort of take the view to leaders to choose. So I just want to ask you, Becky, sort of, first of all, you know, Keir Starmer keeps saying, and all his colleagues, they've been told they've got to say further and faster, whatever the hell that actually means. But I think it means more of the same. Is that a plan that can revive Labour fortunes?
No, I think we need to see a change of course and fast. I was in Runcorn last week. I've got family that live there, knocked on a lot of doors, and time again I was met with people who weren't just angry, they were emotionally destroyed by things such as the winter fuel allowance cut, the potential cuts that are coming down the line in relation to disability benefits, not reversing the two-child cap on universal credit, and they felt that the party was leaving them. They felt that the party wasn't the Labour Party anymore and that it wasn't the party of the people. And that message should send shockwaves to Number 10. We've got to address those issues and we've got to make sure that we're demonstrably helping the people that we were elected to serve.
There's an important follow-up question I want to come to, but I'm going to come to it in a minute or two because I'm now going to go to Therese and just say, look, when I talk to your colleagues, it wasn't that long ago you're an MP, you're now in the House of Lords, your MP colleagues, a lot of them say you've got to do some kind of a deal with Reform, which is what everybody thought Robert Jenrick was saying recently. He slightly denies it. And then others say our only hope is to bring back Boris Johnson. I mean, the results were disastrous for the Tory party. How do you revive?
Well, we hit a very high threshold, a high bar in 2021. You know, not long had the vaccine been developed. So this really was a challenge for us. But let's not pretend that they weren't other than very difficult results, and I particularly feel for our councillors. But in terms of a coalition reform, what I see with Reform in particular, but to some extent the Liberal Democrats, is a reaction that both no trust regained yet in the Conservatives after our drubbing last year, but also there are large parts where Labour isn't working and people feel let down by Labour. So I think there's a reaction against the two main parties that have been in government over the last several decades. And I appreciate the Liberals came in the coalition, but I think some of their approach wouldn't lend itself to being in a coalition again, but we'll see.
I'm not sure I, though, gleaned from that how you think your party revives.
Well, I think that the answer is not just saying that we're going to go in coalition with Reform. That's, we're a broad church. I think Reform is, as I say, a reaction. What I do think, though, and it's happened in a number of elections over the years, if I think back to 1989, when the Greens did brilliantly, actually in the European elections, there was a reaction then to prompt parties to consider carefully environmental policies in what they were doing, but also thinking some of the other issues. And it is prompting, I think, the parties to think carefully about how we can really make the immigration reforms stick. And that's why some of the stuff that Kemi is now saying, we've got to regain trust and there needs to be some good, deep strategic thinking. Not averse to doing short-term measures. That's why various amendments to various bills and summed up today in what they're presenting as a deportation bill is addressing some of the frustrations that people have about when bad things do bad bad people do bad things, we should be able to deport these people.
Well, look, we've got to explore further, you know, how much of an existential threat Farage poses to you. But, Daisy, I suppose one of the things I was struck by, obviously your vote share did go up in these locals and mayoral elections. But it is striking to me, you saw on the screen there, that similar numbers of Labour voters are defecting to Reform, which definitely doesn't share your values, as defect to the Liberal Democrats. Slightly says to me, you've got to, I don't know quite what you do to capture those disillusioned Labour voters, but you're not quite doing enough, are you?
Well, let's be clear, a lot of local elections were cancelled in May. And had the elections gone ahead in places like Surrey or West Sussex or East Sussex, we would have been hoping for some very, very strong results in those areas.
But you're still very much a sort of regionally focused party. If you really want to cut through in the way that Reform is cutting through, you've got to be more popular everywhere.
Well, look, I think we got our best result ever in the general election last year, the best result ever in the history of our party. In this set of local elections, we overtook the Conservatives, both in terms of the number of councillors, the number of councils and overall vote share. We actually beat Labour as well for the first time ever in terms of the number of councillors. So we're pretty chuffed with the responses and the result we got last week.
And can I just finish with you, Becky, before we go to an interview I did a little bit earlier with the Business Secretary, Johnny Reynolds. There's a lot of panicky criticism from some of your colleagues of, you know, the direction that the Prime Minister is taking the country in, of the way that Downing Street is managing things. Actually, I addressed that a bit with Reynolds in a minute or two. In some ways, this is extraordinary. You're only 10 months in from the election, which you won with an overwhelming landslide. It's sort of... Why do you think so many of your colleagues are so worried so early?
Because it was clear that some of the policy decisions that had been made were ill-advised. The winter fuel allowance was the wrong decision to make, in my view. Not reversing the two-child cap on universal credit, the wrong decision. And now, potentially, cutting the benefits of disabled people, the wrong decision. We've got to listen to our voters, our lifelong Labour voters and the voters that we want to woo, and understand that these are issues that are important to them. And it's an interesting, there's been an interesting set of polling that was done over the weekend that looked at Labour switchers, but also Reform voters. And interestingly, a lot of Reform voters want to see a more left-wing economic agenda. They want to see nationalisation of key utilities. They want to see our industries protected from foreign takeovers. These are all traditional Labour positions. So we need to listen to that and recognise that that's certainly the direction that we should be taking the party in, and protecting the most vulnerable and the people that need us the most.
Absolutely fascinating. Going to come back to all three of you in a minute or two. Now, you'll probably be aware that a little earlier this week, the government announced an important trade deal with India. Actually, the most ambitious trade deal that India has done. And it comes against, obviously, the background of Donald Trump's protectionism. So, in that sense, it's symbolically even more important. I talked to Jonathan Reynolds about it, who's the Business Secretary, a little earlier. And the thing I put to him was that, to an extent, it's been overshadowed by this row that, as part of the agreement with India, the Indian nationals who work in the UK won't any longer have to pay, or some of them, not all of them, some of them won't have to pay national insurance. So I said, given he's given other data about the trade deal, could he at last now give us the numbers of Indian nationals who would not any longer have to pay national security here, national insurance here?
Well, look, this is absolute nonsense from political opponents about the India trade deal. There's no two-tier tax system. There's no one being undercut. There's no differential treatment if two people, one's an Indian national, one's a British national, apply for the same job. It's a very specific thing where people who are on intercompany transfers, perhaps an Indian national coming to the UK for a short period of time, or a UK national going to India, where you have these arrangements to make sure you're not simultaneously paying into two social security systems. So these kind of agreements mean now we have in place, I think, them for 50 countries that the UK has as major partners. India's not being treated any differently to the US or the EU or Japan or Canada, many of the partners as part of that. It means the UK worker temporarily in India would pay into our system, not the Indian system. It means the Indian worker temporarily in the UK would pay into their system. I think that's a far better way of doing it. It aids business mobility, but we are not talking about a very large group of people in either case because of those very specific circumstances. And of course, a deal like
not
this,
a very
because
large
it's such
number.
a big deal,
I mean, it's just prove to our wonderful viewers that you've got nothing to hide. When you say not a very large number, we're talking a few thousand, I imagine, not tens of thousands.
I mean, it varies obviously depending on the success of trade between the two countries, but you know, relative to the kinds of figures we're used to in terms of population flows between the two countries, relatively small. And the number of
Secretary of State, the reason I suppose there's a bit of scepticism around this is you put out some estimates about the value of the free trade agreement to the UK. And, you know, these are encouraging numbers. You know, an increase over the next 15 years in British exports to India of almost £16 billion, addition to our national income of almost £5 billion. These are really complicated calculations to make, and yet you've made them. This arrangement on national insurance has been under negotiation for a couple of years. You must have the numbers, even if they're just estimates. So is it a few thousand?
There's about 20,000. There's about 20,000 Indian workers in the UK at the moment who'd be in that position. But of course, it's reciprocal for UK workers in India, and the nature of the deal, because it's such a good deal for the UK with the fastest growing major economy, is the actual growth and upside in this will be on more people temporarily for business mobility going from the UK to India. So the upside of this is very much in our favour. And at the same time, this is a deal.
But I'd also just like to, because this seems to me to be, as you say, for the government, a good news story. We're looking, on your estimates, at an increase, as I say, in our national income of £4.8 billion. You know, could be a bit more, could be a bit less, but that's a significant increase in our national...
A year, 4.8 billion a year as well for every year. That's one of the crucial parts.
Obviously, I assume people would take that for granted. So, just to be clear, let's just say that the loss to the Exchequer is, which I assume it is on 20,000, something like 100 million to 200 million pounds. That's money well spent, isn't it?
Well, but don't forget, Robert, that the deal, because it's such a good deal for us in the UK, is an increase in revenue coming to the Exchequer. So it's not a cost as a deal. The money, the additional tax
what I'm just saying,
revenue, well over £1 billion pounds.
It's an upfront cost to generate revenues.
Absolutely.
But
it's not so much an upfront cost. It's a deal that generates more revenue for the UK, more economic activity, more exports, more jobs, more growth, higher wages. I mean, it is a good story by any definition, and I think maybe some of our opponents are a little bit embarrassed that we've been able to do what they promised but couldn't deliver. We've done it in less time. We've delivered an absolutely cracking deal for every part of the UK and a new phase of UK-India relations.
Can I just double-check? As I say, it was my calculation that the NI loss won't be more than 200 million. That's right, isn't it?
It'll be less than that, but the overall gain in revenue to the Exchequer is well over £1 billion.
Can I just check one other aspect of this? The leader of the Conservative Party, Coffey, has attacked you for this national insurance agreement. The FT reports this afternoon that Indian officials say that she agreed to a 2-year waiver, which is, you know, it's 1 year less than you, but is that your understanding, that, you know, this was not only actively being negotiated, but she agreed to it?
Well, look, she will have to account for her own statements on this. There's been a couple of times recently where I don't think some of the things she said has tallied with my personal experience. But that is for the leader of the opposition.
You can just answer it yes or no. Again, the Financial Times is reporting that in what you're likely to agree with America, that you will amend our digital services tax. Is that right or wrong?
Look, I can't go into some of the details, but we've always said
people will take that as a confirmation that you will amend it.
It's also worth saying that the digital services tax was always an interim arrangement in lieu of a wider international agreement on the fair tax treatment of digital companies. We wanted an international agreement through the OECD, the key international body, in this. We weren't successful at that. Didn't happen on a global scale. So we always have been of the position that we will work with other countries on a fair way to do this, recognising that traditional forms of taxation don't always capture the economic activity of tech companies by the nature of those companies in a country like the UK.
I've got two questions which you are at liberty to answer as fast as possible. You have a red wall seat. You'll have seen the so-called red wall group of MPs calling on the government to reverse its decision to end universal entitlement to winter fuel allowance. Is there any chance of that happening?
Look, I know exactly the pressures those areas, those colleagues are under. That's not just where I represent, it's where I live, and I understand that. The decision to